High above the Arctic Circle, on a thin layer of sea ice, an American sports hunter shoots what he believes is a polar bear. He is mistaken.
I could see he was white, but I couldn't tell that he was what he was.
It's something that I've never experienced, and that's one thing that I'll never forget.
The killing unleashes an investigation.
He's looking at me like I was a criminal already.
No one can tell exactly what he has shot.
I wasn't convinced from the beginning of what it was.
The hunter under threat of prosecution for a crime he says he didn't commit.
I wasn't out there trying to kill an illegal bear.
Scientists pore over the corpse of an animal they've never seen before.
We knew that there was definitely something unique.
With each new discovery, the mystery deepens.
This is the single sample that aroused the most curiosity.
Their target is to discover the exact species of this animal. It begins as the adventure of a lifetime for Jim Martell, a businessman from Glens Ferry, Idaho.
I've been hunting since I was about 8 years old. And first 20 years of my marriage, I couldn't do this kind of thing, which now I'm almost too old to do it.
Hunting polar bears for sport is illegal in the United States, so 65-year-old Martell pays an Inuit guide, Roger Kaptana, $25,000 to go on a hunt in Canada. Both are unaware that they will end up hunting something else entirely.
We thought we were going out just for a regular polar bear.
The Inuit are allowed to sell 14 such hunts every 12 months. And during the last 45 years, Kaptana has hunted all over the 27,000 square mile Banks Island.
Thousands and thousands of years ago, my ancestors, they learned how to hunt polar bear. It can be dangerous, but that's the type of thing we do here. That's our livelihood.
Although Martell is an experienced hunter, this trip is different from anything he's taken on before.
We had a great time planning the trip. I think I packed 3 times and unpacked 3 times to make sure I had the right gear for the climate. You know, you become a kid again.
Despite the careful planning, this is an adventure loaded with danger. The polar bear is the world's largest land predator and the only species of bear known to deliberately target humans. Standing on its hind legs, it could look an elephant in the eye. With an average weight of up to 1,500 pounds, they pack enormous power. And they can charge at speeds faster than most humans. Arctic expedition organizer Boyd Warner knows the dangers of a polar bear hunt. Warner has over 30 years' experience working in the wilderness of the North.
I've lived in the North all my life, and I wouldn't go out there without an Inuit guide that really knows how to survive in that land. Too much can happen too fast, and when it happens, it's serious.
In order to hunt legally, Martell purchases a $50 permit from the Northwest Territories government.
Once he's got that license and he's got the metal tag and paid for it, yes, he's legal entitled to hunt in Northwest Territories.
But the permit is only for a polar bear. A polar bear hunt can take up to 2 weeks, requiring up to 12 hours travel a day in the back of a bone-shaking sled, facing life-threatening conditions. The two men travel on a 3-foot-thick layer of frozen sea, raked by Arctic winds.
It aches in a matter of seconds, so you just don't uncover your skin at all. But you do shiver all the time. I had a stocking cap, goggles, everything to keep from getting frostbite.
Martel finds the adventure far harder than he expected. After 3 days in the sled, there is no sign of a polar bear. "75 miles away from the sanctuary of Saxe Harbor, out on the frozen sea off Nelson Head, he takes refuge. While Martel rests, Kaptana keeps watch for any sign of a polar bear. At first light, the Inuit guide wakes his client. He has spotted movement on a ridge to the north.
It was about 5 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you.
Hadn't had our breakfast or anything yet, but he came and said, "Do you want to go after it on foot?" And I said, "Oh, sure." So I got up and in a hurry, got dressed, got my rifle, and put on white clothes, and then went after it.
Leaving their dogs behind, Kaptana and Martel, without radios or any other means of contact, set out on foot.
He told me it's about 2 miles away.
The men take the long way around to surprise the bear.
The only way we could get at him was if we could track him as quietly as possible. Then I knew we had a chance.
To keep downwind, Martel and Kaptana head west, across rougher terrain. Just 300 yards south of the ridge, Kaptana sees the bear moving.
At that point,
Get ready.
the adrenaline is flowing. I could see he was getting ready to make a run for it.
That's when Roger said, "Shoot."
Shoot.
He didn't hesitate, so I didn't either.
Both men can see the bear fall.
I got him. He said that was a great shot. 300-yard shot's a pretty good shot, offhand, with no rest. I was pretty sure that it was a kill shot.
The two men approached the bear.
As we got closer, like 50 yards, it started to look a little bit different, you know.
Once we got within 50 feet, then Roger said, "Well, wait right here. I'm going to check it out."
Like anything else, you've got to take risk.
The bear appears to be dead.
I thought he was dead. He looked dead, but they'll play possum sometime.
He approached him from behind to make sure he was not alive. Then he said, "Come on up," and then I did. But I stood there with the rifle in case it did, come alive.
Live or dead, this is not what they'd expected to find.
I could see that he was a little bit of a different bear. But at that point, I wasn't quite sure what kind of a polar bear he was.
He brushed off the snow off of his face and his back.
The animal is certainly dead, but this is unlike any bear the Inuit guide has ever seen. Martel hands Kaptana his camera. The polar bear has dark rings around its eyes. and an abnormal hump on its back.
It's something that I've never seen before on a polar bear.
Whatever this is, it does not appear to be a normal polar bear. "300 miles south of Banks Island, an agent travels to pick up an American sports hunter. On a remote airstrip, Martel is returning with the bloody remains of the strange polar bear he shot near Sachs Harbor. All hunters have to prove to the territorial government that the animal they've shot corresponds with their permit.
We're here basically to enforce, make sure everybody's within terms of the conditions of their license.
If Martel has anything in the crate other than a polar bear, he will be cited for breaking the law.
Our job is to basically make sure everything's legal.
"9 days earlier, on Banks Island, Inuit, Roger Kaptana had skinned the bear.
You roll him back over on the skin, and then skin the other side off. You kind of peel it off of him like you do a banana, actually.
Martel wanted the skin as his trophy and needed other body parts to meet legal requirements.
We take the hide off the carcass itself and take the head off.
But the shape of the head is unusual for a polar bear.
The head was slightly larger than a polar bear.
Although Kaptana had done this more than 90 times, he'd never seen flesh this color before.
The meat itself seemed to be a little bit lighter than a polar bear, you know.
The carcass and guts are left behind. Martel and Kaptana take the bear's skin, its skull, and 2 small bones.
Those are the things that are required to bring back.
On the mainland, the government's officers immediately begin to examine the bear's body parts in the lab.
So we do take that hide and we do examine it.
We'll remove a post-canine tooth. We'll measure the bear. We'll take biological samples.
They determine this animal is a 7-foot 1-inch male bear. But no one, including the biologist in Inuvik, Marsha Brannigan, is certain what kind of bear.
I wasn't convinced from the beginning what it was.
One thing is certain, they don't believe that what Martel has brought back is a normal polar bear. Martel is required to explain himself.
He said, "You need to come in my office," and he was going to fill out my testimony of this hunt.
They're required under law to provide information.
I went in and explained what had happened, you know, as far as shooting this animal. And he said, "We're going to have this animal tested, or you're going to be fined."
Martel is at risk of a $1,000 fine, a small amount for a successful businessman. But more devastating than a fine is a criminal conviction and a tarnished reputation as a hunter. The officers have never encountered anything like this before. From their visual inspection, they surmise this is not a polar bear. Martel is accused of illegal possession of wildlife.
I got mad when I was in the office, and I finally had to kind of bark back at him, and then he calmed down a little bit.
Feels comfortable to which way he knows.
The officers are unyielding. They have never seen a polar bear with brown rings around its eyes.
It wasn't looking like a polar bear. I've never seen a polar bear with any kind of brown markings on it, period.
Government officers conduct further tests to determine the species of the bear. They cut off samples of flesh and hair, and then impound the skin into storage.
They had rolled it up, and they confiscated it and kept it. And so I was kind of angry.
The flesh and hair samples are sent to Wildlife Genetics International in Nelson, British Columbia. Here, DNA analyst Dr. David Paco and his team are assigned to unlock its genetic code.
It was really pretty simple instructions, just document the species status of the sample.
This sample, however, is different.
It did look kind of weird. It was a strange color, but more of an orange with quite a bit of blonde at the end. So right away it was kind of strange.
The team uses police forensic techniques to determine the species of the bear. The team first tries to match the DNA from this sample to the DNA from other polar bears. Because this bear had been shot on a remote Arctic island, they immediately assume this sample is from a polar bear.
They had expected it to assign to a polar bear, but when I got the first analysis done, I kind of went, oh, uh-oh. It just didn't assign to a polar bear.
Meanwhile, rumors that the animal found on Banks Island is not a polar bear are traveling fast throughout the isolated community of Sachs Harbor. When the Inuvik authorities release the bear's skin on May the 10th, and it arrives in Yellowknife at the workshop of taxidermist Greg Robertson, he too is intrigued by what he finds. Robertson has won many awards for his work over 20 years in the business. He's worked on over 600 bears, but has never seen one like this.
And we were kind of surprised when we got it that it was something totally different. I think the biggest thing for me was the odor. Polar bear has a very oily type of fishy smell to it.
Polar bears are carnivores. Their main diet is seal, and their flesh usually smells of seal.
This didn't have that at all.
Robertson could smell something mustier. This observation matches Jim Martell and Roger Kaptana's when they'd skinned the bear on Banks Island.
Roger wanted to see what the bear was eating. So he opened him up.
Kaptana began to cut into the animal's intestines.
He just opened him up and was looking through everything that was in there.
As I cut it open, I saw bits and pieces of seal and something I didn't really quite recognize. I didn't know whether it was rodent-like or what.
You could see furry particles that was in there. It must have been a ground squirrel or something.
Seals are a common part of a polar bear's diet. Ground squirrels are not. However, they are a common food source for the grizzly bear. Could this bear, in fact, be a grizzly? Another name for the grizzly bear is brown bear. They are typically brown in color, with silver tips on the ends of their hair, giving them a grizzled appearance. Though infrequently seen, blonde-colored grizzlies have been previously found and photographed in the wild. It seems likely to government biologist Marsha Brannigan that the bear shot by Martell was one of these.
I've captured really blonde grizzlies. We just assumed it was a blonde grizzly.
Is it possible that what Martell had shot is a blonde grizzly? Grizzly bears are found across vast areas of mainland Canada. But normally they don't travel beyond the north coast. South of the coastline are the resources they need to thrive. why would grizzlies venture north, away from land, towards a barren, treeless wilderness like Banks Island, some 300 miles off the Canadian coast? Government biologist Marsha Brannigan had a theory.
They're bare-ground grizzlies. They live out on the open tundra, so it's not, that much different up on Banks than it is on the mainland. Grizzly bears are omnivores. They'll eat anything. If they can find something to eat, they'll eat it. They likely could find something to eat up there.
The authorities believe a blonde grizzly could have made its way north over the frozen sea onto Banks Island in search of food. In 2003, a lone grizzly bear had been found on Melville Island, another 100 miles north of Banks Island. This is the furthest north a grizzly bear had ever been documented. It seems plausible to Brannigan that a grizzly could be found on Banks Island.
It's not normal territory for them. It's rare, but it's not unheard of.
Martel is adamant he had no intention of breaking the law.
I wasn't out there trying to kill an illegal bear.
Martel feels he's the victim of a miscarriage of justice and maintains he shot a polar bear.
When you pay the kind of money you pay to go polar bear hunting, you don't shoot something else.
When taxidermist Greg Robertson tries to choose a frame for the animal's skin in Yellowknife, neither a polar nor a grizzly shape will fit.
The shape was similar to a grizzly. It had a skull, looked like a grizzly, but the fur shape of a polar bear, basically. Never seen that before.
Robertson doesn't alter the shape or size of the skin. Yet as he tries to fit it to the frame, the differences mount up.
The length of the neck, the size of the neck had to be altered, and the head had a lot of alterations to it.
The skin is not only the wrong shape, but also much longer than a normal grizzly's.
We've mounted a lot of grizzlies. We have yet to mount one 7.5, 8 feet.
In British Columbia, geneticist David Paco and his team worked to make sense of the sample of hair and flesh taken from the bear.
This is the single sample that has aroused the most curiosity with everyone standing around the computer monitor.
The lab is under great pressure to deliver the DNA results. Unable to find a perfect match for a pure polar bear, they begin to look at other possibilities. There are 8 species of bear, but only 3 that are native to North America: the polar, the grizzly, and the black bear.
We had reference data from polar bears, grizzly bears, black bears. It was definitely far different from a black bear.
If it isn't a black bear, and pure polar bear has already been ruled out, there is only one possibility left. But it seems doubtful to the scientists. Their analysis would prove this bear is a grizzly.
They've assured me that indeed that would have been weird to have a grizzly bear out there.
Yet as the results come in, it becomes clear there are elements of grizzly DNA in the sample.
There's some element of surprise. Oh, we were pretty excited.
Given this evidence, the original accusation Martel had killed something other than a polar bear would still seem valid. American hunter Jim Martel stands accused of shooting an illegal bear. When he fired his rifle on April the 16th, 2006, Martel was 300 yards away from the bear.
I knew where I was aiming. I aimed right for the lung cavity, right behind the front shoulder.
With the benefit of his rifle sight, Martel had a clear view of the bear.
I could see he was white and everything.
Shoot!
My guide told me to shoot it, and I shot it.
Martel's Inuit guide, Roger Kaptana, also had a clear sight of the bear.
When I originally saw it from 300 yards, I was sure it was a pure polar bear.
Martel is not the only one potentially in trouble.
The hunter ultimately is responsible, but in this case, because it's an outfitted hunt, the outfitter, also Roger, would have been potentially facing charges.
Warner has studied grizzlies' behavior on the Canadian mainland for over 30 years, and it seems unlikely to him this bear would ever prove to be a grizzly.
The bears don't come out of hibernation on the mainland until often about May 10th.
But this bear was shot on April the 16th, at least a month earlier. Warner believes it's unlikely Martel could have shot a grizzly bear on April the 16th. At the Wildlife Genetics Lab in Nelson, the DNA team need to be 100% certain about their results.
We knew we had to do as many tests as we could so that people didn't have those kinds of questions.
The government's case against Martel rests on their analysis. By doing more tests, they're sure their findings are accurate.
We're absolutely certain. There's no way that that genotype that we got for that piece of skin came from a polar bear or a grizzly bear. Where it gets trickier is saying what it did come from.
Adding more data didn't bring it closer to one or the other. It just confirmed that it was neither.
The sample is not a perfect match to either species. The bear shot on Banks Island is neither a pure polar nor a pure grizzly. Although they hold off releasing their findings as they continue their analysis, this discovery would make the government authorities' position that the bear is a blonde grizzly no longer tenable. But Martel and Kaptana are not off the hook. Martel's permit was for a polar bear, and this is clearly not a pure polar bear. After 45 years living in polar bear territory, Kaptana believes there is still much to learn about the bears of the Arctic, and especially about this bear. He thinks that information is scarce in spite of modern technology.
Even with helicopters and aircraft, the scientists have a hard time keeping track of all the bears that we have.
Biologists monitor any polar bears they can find on Banks Island by tagging them with GPS locators.
About 95% of the bears we get are not tagged, so that indicates that they're missing a great deal of information out there.
Perhaps this bear is one example of a new, undiscovered species.
We knew that there was definitely something unique. The back feet were odd. This had a large pad in the front and a large pad in the back with about an inch or an inch and a half band of fur separating the two right across, which is unusual in any species of bear.
Neither grizzly nor polar bears have two large pads on their hind feet. If this bear is so unusual, could it be one example of a new species combining both polar and grizzly bear? James Mallet is Professor of Biological Diversity at University College London.
I think it's very unlikely that there's a new bear species out there, mainly because people have hunted there. And there's been a fur trade for hundreds of years, and people would have noticed it if it had been there.
it seems unlikely an entirely new species of bear would survive undiscovered. In Yellowknife, taxidermist Robertson is convinced what he is seeing is evidence of something unique.
The unusual thing to me was its claws. They were basically in between the size of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. He had sort of a combination between the two.
The 5 claws of a polar bear are thick, short and sharp, adapted for efficient traction on ice. Whereas those of a grizzly bear are long and curved, critical for excavating dens or digging for food. The claws of this animal merge all these characteristics. Could it be possible that the 2 different bear species had mated, resulting in the strange bear killed by Martel? Is it in fact a hybrid? And if so, how did the 2 species come into contact or mate in the wild? Their natural habitats and food sources are different. Historically, there is a precedent for a hybrid polar grizzly. In the 19th century, amateurs bred hybrids in captivity.
In the Victorian times, of course, anyone who was interested in natural history would have been interested in these freaks of nature. Obviously, there were some bad scientists who were just after kind of sensations and who did more circus acts.
Collectors experimented to see what kinds of strange animals would result from crossbreeding. Lions with tigers, horses with zebras, pumas with leopards.
If you've got a freak of nature, you want to know how it becomes like that.
These were mutant animals that were paraded in front of an astounded public. And among them, a hybrid bear, a cross of polar and grizzly. Bred in captivity in Germany in 1874. The only time a hybrid bear had been seen before was the result of captive mating. Had someone in northern Canada been inspired with a similarly deviant intent to captively mate these 2 species of bear? Or could it have occurred naturally in the wild? In the remote Canadian town of Inuvik, government officers try to determine if the bear shot by American hunter Jim Martel is what he says it is, just an unusual polar bear. There is no evidence to support the possibility this is a hybrid bear bred in captivity.
With regards to if it was bred in captivity and released, I don't believe so.
The nearest zoo that has both captive grizzlies and polar bears is over 2,500 miles away from Banks Island. There are no reports of any animals having escaped. But if the bear is a hybrid and hadn't been bred in captivity, then it must have occurred naturally in the wild.
I think what happened is a female polar bear and a grizzly male got together and they just decided to go nature's way.
Except for the fact that the 2 species do not normally cross paths in the wild. Polar bear females do not normally travel south from the islands onto the Canadian mainland.
We put out 20 collars on female polar bears in 2000 and monitored them for 3 or 4 years. And none of them really seemed to come on the land. So there was no movements onto the mainland.
So, had a male grizzly traveled to a remote Arctic island to mate with a female polar bear? Biologist Rob Mulders specializes in tracking the movements of grizzlies in northern Canada.
Our unique finding was that these bears are actually using huge areas relative to other grizzly bear populations. The males are using 7,145 square kilometers.
Using GPS tracking devices, North Canadian grizzlies have been observed traveling hundreds of miles during spring.
These are the largest home ranges known for grizzly bears.
And many have been tracked heading north, away from their usual territory. With over 30 years' experience, wilderness expert Boyd Warner speculates why.
Two things have to be happening. Either there's no food in their home area, or there's just too many bears in the home area and these ones are getting pushed out.
Grizzlies are indeed capable of traveling 300 miles north from the mainland to Banks Island, using the frozen sea as a bridge. The grizzlies are entering polar bear territory.
Grizzly bears are showing up in places that they've never been seen before, so they're starting to mix more and more with the polar bear range.
Evidence indicates an increasing movement of grizzlies towards the frozen north. But no one has ever documented the two species mating in the wild. And the Canadian government authorities know only one documented instance of their meeting, in a completely different population of bears. American biologist James Wilder studies the polar bears that feed on whale carcasses in northern Alaska.
They look like mastodons out there, and they have all these prehistoric sounding vocalizations.
After thousands of hours up close with the bears, Wilder and the team of scientists become familiar with their behavior. But while filming at night, the team observes a startling event.
Some of the adult male polar bears were probably pushing 1,200 pounds or more even. Then out comes this 4-foot tall, 300-pound grizzly bear that absolutely stampedes the polar bears that are there.
What they filmed is astounding evidence of the meeting of the two species of bear. But there is no evidence in the footage of any inclination to mate.
Polar bears definitely seem to have a natural aversion to grizzly bears. The grizzly bear scent blowing to the polar bears, that was enough to trigger them to run off.
The natural reaction of these two species is to avoid each other. Under what circumstances would these natural enemies mate? The Inuit guide Kuptana has a clue. He has observed the mating behavior of polar bears.
What usually happens is, even if a female doesn't want, she's so terrified that she just submits, you know.
The mating of polar bears is an aggressive act, and encounters between polars and grizzlies also aggressive. It looks extremely unlikely the two species will mate. However, expedition organizer Boyd Warner knew of a bizarre story from an Inuit guide.
The north tip of Victoria Island, Inuit guides were up there, and they came across tracks of a grizzly bear tracking a female with two cubs, which was a polar bear, and they followed it and found where the grizzly had killed one of the cubs. It's largely believed that they kill the cubs to try and bring the female back in heat sooner.
By killing her cubs, the grizzly could be trying to force the female polar back into heat, suggesting a grizzly's intent to mate with a polar bear in the wild. The likely scenario is the bear killed by Martel resulted from these two different bear species mating near Banks Island.
I do believe it was somewhere off the coast of Banks Island here.
A grizzly had made its way north from the mainland in pursuit of food and a mate.
They need food, and they also have the urge to reproduce, and I'm not sure which takes precedence.
This aggressive loner had traveled vast distances, using the frozen sea as a bridge to the islands. He'd crossed onto Banks Island and smelled out a female polar bear. And then mated with her. This theory seems to be the most plausible idea of how the hybrid bear shot by Martel came about. In Nelson, British Columbia, after more tests, geneticist David Paco and his team make a breakthrough. Unable to get a perfect match to either a pure polar or pure grizzly bear, they reach a radical conclusion.
Well, we were pretty excited. It's clearly a very rare occurrence.
It continuously assigned between the grizzly bear and polar bear populations, and so we could only conclude that it must be a hybrid.
We're very confident that it's a hybrid.
The DNA analysis reveals without doubt that the bear is a hybrid. Further tests give more information. By amplifying the genetic code in the DNA, Paco is able to reveal that the mother of the hybrid is in fact a polar bear.
If, as we contend, it's a 50-50 mix of the two species, then by exclusion, the father was a brown bear.
This is a bear that appears to be the result of a catalogue of unlikely chances. Its father, a grizzly, headed into territory it did not normally inhabit. Found its mother, a female polar bear, in a 27,000 square mile wilderness. This odd couple produced a healthy cub that continued to thrive undiscovered for 6 years. Until April the 16th.
Shoot.
2006. Martel had shot an extremely rare hybrid bear, the polar grizz.
For me, it's exciting because I have the only one, number one. Oh, I feel great about it, yeah.
The government authorities in the Northwest Territories of Canada are forced to make a ruling on whether the animal shot by Martel is an illegal possession of wildlife.
It's the first time it's ever been documented. It definitely was an interesting result.
The bear is technically half polar, and the officers decide that Martel is innocent. The accusation is revoked.
When the analysis was done and it came back as half polar bear, you can't say that that's an illegal take. I mean, it's a polar bear.
Although the US government has since banned the importation of trophy polar bears, in 2006, Martel is free to take the bear home.
It's a beautiful animal, and I'm proud to have it at my home.
News that this animal is a wild hybrid starts to reverberate worldwide.
My wife said, "Oh, how is my famous husband?" And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, haven't you heard?" I said, "Heard what?" And she told me the story about, well, you're all over the world in the newspapers.
All the articles report Martel shot the rarest bear on Earth.
I got a lot of emails, a lot of calls. I mean, I had some calls that they wanted to shoot me from the States.
Yet this was a fluke incident, a legal hunt in the vast wilderness. If the bear hadn't been found and shot by Martel, it would never have been documented as the first instance of a wild hybrid polar grizz. Although the hybrid bear is a unique discovery, this bear cannot be regarded as a new species. It can only be classified as a new species if there is more than one animal, and they can reproduce among themselves. But Martel believes his bear may not be the only one.
I think if there's one, there's more. It happened once, it'll happen again. That's the way I feel.
Martel's Inuit guide, Roger Kaptana, believes there are more hybrid bears out there.
Polar bear will have 2 or 3 cubs It's quite possible that it has brothers and sisters out there.
I mean, you see 2 cubs lots of times with polar bears. Grizzly bears, you see 3 cubs frequently.
If the polar grizz had siblings, there might be more hybrid bears nearby.
In the same winter that Jim got his, another bear was seen by a sports hunter and guides, and it was obviously a very dark bear. Different characteristics a little bit than this one, larger, but definitely wasn't right, and those guys know what's right.
It seems the polar grizz, though extremely rare, may not be a one-off. Professor James Mallet believes the blonde grizzlies observed by government officers might be yet further evidence of wild hybrid bears.
The pale grizzlies, I think, may indicate that some crossing has gone on in the past. It wouldn't be improbable, certainly not based on what we know about other species.
This case has changed the way Canadian government officers view the bears of the Arctic.
There's been incidental sightings of bears that are described to me as very blonde grizzly bears. I never really thought of them as possibly being hybrids until this happened.
And the incident could rewrite the biology textbook.
We always think of evolution being a process. We start with one population, it splits into 2, they stay separate for long enough that they can no longer interbreed when they next make contact. But there's absolutely no reason that they couldn't at some point come back together and produce something else. It could indeed be a natural part of evolution at some rate.
This vast icy landscape could indeed contain the beginning of a new species.
So certainly there's every reason to expect that there might be another one out there. Perhaps we'll come across it one of these days.
Jim Martell remains satisfied with his trophy.
I feel I was born a hunter, and I'm still a hunter, and I'm going to keep hunting.
Yet it seems that Martell may indeed be the first, and also the last American sports hunter, to have a hybrid polar grizzly bear in his collection of hunting trophies.